Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. At the end of the third part of his work, Ressentiment, Max Scheler, at considerable length, is going to develop a picture of Christian morality and the Christian message that is going to be, to a great extent, at odds with many reinterpretations of it, particularly those that focus on turning the Christian message into one of social transformation and justice. And he's going to make this claim. He says, I insist that love for one's neighbor in the Christian sense is not originally meant to be a biological, political, or social principle. And, what we're really interested in here is the social and the political. Is the gospel message, the teachings of an example of this guy, Jesus the Christ, is this meant to be something that is a blueprint for how to change society? Now, Scheler does think that society does change over time, and it certainly does in response to Christianity. We'll come to that a bit later. So he's going to follow up with this by saying that love for one's neighbor is directed, at least primarily, at man's spiritual core, his individual personality, through which alone he participates directly in the kingdom of God. And he's going to counterpose this notion of the kingdom of God, which is a expression you see a lot in the Gospels coming directly out of the mouth of Jesus, against any sort of new political order or a new economic distribution of property. So he's saying Jesus isn't trying to radically transform society. In fact, he says he accepts the emperor's rule, the social distinction between master and slave, and all of those natural instincts which cause hostility between men in public and private life. Now, except, yes, in a certain sense, not in the sense of saying all of this is perfectly fine as it is, particularly the hostility part, as we're going to see. But he's going to go on and say there is no idea of general brotherhood, no demand for a leveling of national distinctions through the creation of a universal community corresponding to the Stoic ideal of a universal state. Now, granted, Scheler, like many people of his time, does tend to get Stoicism a bit wrong, but going on, he says, and a universal law of reason and nature, nor is there any tendency to establish an independent Jewish state or realize any social and political utopia. So he's going to conclude this by talking about, again, the kingdom of God in human beings. And he says the immanence of it, the existence of it in human beings is not bound to any particular structure of state and society. So he's going to follow this up by talking about the forces and laws ruling the evolution of life and the formation and development of political and social communities, even wars between nations, class struggle, and the passions they entail. These are all things that Scheler, as a sociologist as well as a phenomenologist, has been studying for a long time and writes about at great length in many other places, including in parts of this work, Ressentiment. So all of these forces and laws he's going to say, are actually taken for granted by Jesus as permanent factors of existence. So what does that mean? Is that, saying that, well, nothing ever really changes once we've, identified these laws and forces, we're stuck in a kind of fatalism? He's not saying that. But instead, he is saying that Jesus doesn't want to try to replace those by love or anything else. And what does this mean? Well, one implication is that he says universal peace or the termination of the social power struggle, these are foreign to Jesus' religious and moral sermon. And so we're going to get a different vision of what peace on earth actually looks like. So peace on earth, which is, again, something that's brought up in the Gospels, how does Scheler reinterpret this? He says, the peace on earth which Jesus is asking for is a profound state of blissful quietude, which is to permeate as from above the historical process of struggle and conflict which governs the evolution of life and human associations. So it's not as if it doesn't have any purchase or point. It's coming in, but it is coming in and not, replacing, but penetrating these human associations. And he calls it a sacred region of peace, love, and forgiveness, existing in the depth of the human soul in the midst of all struggle and preventing him from believing that the goals of the conflict are ultimate and definitive. So in a way, it's a restoration of a greater perspective, an opening up of an alternate horizon, saying this isn't it, this isn't everything, there's something more, and that something more can be existing right in the middle of all of this struggle and strife and conflict and striving. So he goes on and he says, Jesus doesn't mean the struggle should cease. So what does this mean? The paradoxical precept, a very difficult one for Christians, right? Love one's enemy. What does this actually mean? So why is it paradoxical? We should think about that for a moment. Well, if you do truly love your enemy, don't you cease to view them as an enemy? Don't you, if your love is actually efficacious, transform them from being an enemy into at least a non-enemy, or perhaps even a friend, or somebody who is beloved? So there's that aspect that's paradoxical. There's the other aspect that's paradoxical where, somebody could say, well, why in the hell should I love somebody who hates me? Why shouldn't I reciprocate hatred with hatred? And, why is love going to be the proper response here? And Scheler is going to highlight something very important about this. You can't force people to love their enemy. You can't guilt them into genuine love. It has to be, as he's going to say, a free sacrifice, a gift, essentially, to somebody who doesn't deserve it. And that's part of the message. So he says that it's not meant as a praise of those whose instincts are too weak for enmity. Nietzsche thought that that's what Christians were really about. On the contrary, he says, the precept of loving one's enemy presupposes the existence of hostility. It accepts the fact there are forces in human nature which sometimes necessarily lead to hostile relations and cannot be historically modified. It only demands one thing, that even the true and genuine enemy, he who I know to be my enemy and who I'm justified in combating with all means at my disposal, should be my brother. Now, notice what he says here. He doesn't say should be my brother in society, should be my brother within my family, I should treat them as if they are my friend. He says, no, they are a brother within again, the kingdom of God, this sacred region of peace, love, and forgiveness, out of which one gives to the other. So what would this look like? Scheler is going to go on and say, well, here's one index of it. In the midst of the struggle, hatred should be absent, especially that ultimate hatred which is directed against the salvation of his soul. There's no value in the disappearance or moderation of revenge, power, mastery, and subjugation, which are acknowledged as belonging to a complete living being. So you treat the enemy still as an enemy, but you don't have to hate your enemy, and you certainly don't have to want to see them cast down into hell or to the outer darkness where there's gnashing of teeth and et cetera, et cetera. You don't have to treat them as an enemy in that way. You can acknowledge that you're opposed and still extend something to them. And this lies in, again, going back to this peace, love, forgiveness motif, the virtue, he says, lies in the free sacrifice of these impulses and of the actions expressing them in favor of the more valuable act of forgiveness and toleration. And he says something really, really interesting here about the nature of forgiveness and toleration. You can't forgive if you feel no impulse towards retaliation or revenge. You're not really forgiving in that case. You're just kind of going along with it, right? And you can't tolerate if you're merely insensitive. You don't care whatsoever. That's not genuine toleration. These are not acts of the free human being, he would say. And so he's going to shift gears now and talk about economic arrangements. And he says that the greatest mistake would be to interpret the Christian movement on the basis of analogies with certain forms of the modern socialist and democratic movement. Jesus is not a kind of popular hero who knows what ails the poor and oppressed, an enemy of mammon. And he says a lot of people have interpreted Jesus this way, particularly in modern times. So it's not surprising that Friedrich Nietzsche, who's encountering all this, would get, confused about that. Right? He says Christianity does not contain the germ of modern socialistic and democratic tendencies and value judgments. And then he goes on and says it also doesn't assert this catchphrase, the equality of all souls before God. As a matter of fact, that, he says, so there's two aspects of this. One is sometimes we think that people are unequal when really they're not. And that could be stemming, as he says, from narrow-mindedness, blindness, self-interest. But the notion that all people are equivalent, that all value distinctions, that's not really there, and that's what Christianity is undermining. He says that's not actually Christianity, it's more Spinoza than anything else. And what else can we say about this? He says that if we could actually see things the way that God sees them, we would not think that God sees everybody as equal. He says God sees an immeasurable abundance of differences and value distinctions where our eyes, fixed on outward appearances, see nothing but a seeming uniformity in value, right? So we're actually a bit mistaken. Now, the fact that God sees differences that we don't see doesn't mean that God doesn't love, doesn't value. God is infinite love. So maybe we can take a sort of lesson from that. Then he talks about community of property. Now, a lot of people will look at the book of Acts and say, aha, see, the early church had a community of property. That's what we should have now in the present, certainly within the religious community, also within the larger society. And Scheler is perfectly willing to call the original Christian communities, he's willing to say that they have a communistic organization, right? He calls it economic He says there's no inner bond between Christian morality and economic communism, which is derived from democratic eudaimonism. So the community of property, what was it actually based on? It was an outward expression, he says, of the unity of heart and soul. People were allowed to contribute what they were going to. They weren't told that they have to. That would be a big difference here. Right? He says there's no artificial and coercive expropriation carried out by the state with conscious purpose of guaranteeing general welfare. And it wasn't believed that the human moral constitution could be changed by the establishment of new property relations. Instead, this, and he's willing to call it communism, was founded on voluntary gifts. And these are valuable. Their value is founded in the act of sacrifice and giving. A choice, a free choice on the part of those who do give. And he says that another key point, the communism of these small early Christian circles applied to the fulfillment of needs, but not to the form of production. And they were surrounded by non-communist communities, but they never indulged in agitation, which was to propagate their way of living. So he says that, all of this actually presupposes an individualistic system of property. It's voluntary gifts within that structure. So he goes on and he says that whenever Christian communism does appear, for example, in monasteries, it is exclusively based on free acts of love and sacrifice, not coercive power being used on people. And the value of these acts lies in the acts and the testimony they bear to spiritual and religious freedom and elevation of the sacrifices as persons. Now we come to thinking about the present day, where Christianity and some of these ideals have indeed had an effect within society, sometimes leading to institutions that perhaps were originally Christian being taken over by the state to provide welfare for people. And Scheler is going to say something really interesting here. He says, Christian love and sacrifice begins where demands of justice and dictates of positive legislation end. So a lot of modern philosophers say, well, we don't need Christian charity anymore. We just reorganize society so that society takes care of people the way that they deserve to be taken care of. We frame it in terms of justice, and we frame it in terms of legislation that will do this. And that indeed was a major part of what was going on in the 19th and 20th centuries. We've seen a lot of paring back of that in the 21st century. Now, does that mean that, we've got sort of a split between, well, you got your secular world over here, and that's doing the sort of functions that religious people and communities were doing over here. So now religious people don't have to do anything, or they can just contribute whatever it is that they want to. But, more or less the poor have been taken care of, the weak, the vulnerable, all of that. Well, Scheler doesn't actually say that. He says that what should happen is that the Christian's love should turn to wider, higher, and more spiritual goals. Christians shouldn't be trying to take over society and rule it and dominate it. They should be focused on, well, what more does this open up the possibility for us to do? If we don't have to provide the kind of welfare, for example, medical or sanitation or, alms, which becomes welfare payments, providing food and things like that. If we don't have to do that anymore because the state is doing that, what more could we be doing? Maybe literacy campaigns, maybe teaching people other things that really matter, directing them towards wider, higher, and more spiritual goals. He says, love doesn't become superfluous and replaced by law and justice. And so, he says, to bring this to a close, that Christian love is always tied to an idea of definitive sacrifice, right? Not just improving people's lives or increasing the amount of pleasure or anything like that. And he says that the danger here is of embracing some ideal goal of development in which all kinds of sacrifice are eliminated. Why? Because that doesn't have anything to do with genuine love, and this is what he takes the gospel message, Christian morality, in its authentic form, to really be about.